And this poem, and thinking about this word cold, is making me think of another poem, an earlier poem, a different kind of poem, an ode, which also works with this word cold in quite a powerful and interesting way. The poem I have in mind is John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. And I'm going to read to you the last part of the last stanza of that poem. So this word cold crops up at the end of Keats's poem, as it does at the end of Carlos Williams's. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know. Both seem to be poems about a kind of cold beauty, about the preservation of natural beauty, its survival. They're also both poems, it seems to me, about loss and about the survival of this loss. Keats's poem addresses another entity. It addresses a Grecian urn and refers to it as you. It gives it an identity. But this poem, William Carlos Williams's poem, also features an I, a speaking self, a first person. To that extent, this is a poem which employs a traditional lyric structure, the traditional structure of a lyric poem. There is an I and there is a you. Lyric poetry is characterized by this relationship between I, thou, or I, you. And as we've seen, the mode of the I in this poem is apologetic. It's apologizing to the you of the poem for having eaten the you's plums. I'm coming to the title of the poem, last of all in this podcast, but I think it gives us a clue to what might be going on in this poem. The title of the poem is This Is Just to Say. A very interesting phrase, as I've suggested at the beginning of this podcast, a phrase that suggests that this is just a note pinned to a fridge door, that it's not a very important statement. But I wonder whether we should trust the title quite that far. Is this really just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast? Is there more going on in this poem than a simple speech act, a simple communication, a simple apology? Is apology ever simple? I think that title lures us, leads us on, encourages us to think about what more might be going on in this poem. The title seems a bit too simple and easy to me. So on that note, what about the word forgive in the last stanza of the poem? The first capitalized word, the first word that begins with a capital letter since the beginning of the poem. What does that word forgiveness make you think of? What might be being invoked by the notion of forgiveness, by the desire for forgiveness that the third stanza of this poem begins with? For me, forgiveness is a word that carries a religious connotation. If I think of being asked to forgive or being asked for forgiveness, I think about a particular Christian mindset. If we think also about the fact that this is a poem which is about the theft of fruit, I think we can begin to explore that religious mindset, which may be lurking around in the background of this poem. Here is a passage from one of my favourite poems, apart from Ode on a Grecian Urn, and This Is Just to Say, which is John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, from the late 1600s, mid to late 1600s. This is a passage from Book 9. Paradise Lost, as its title implies, is a long epic poem which is about the fall of man, about the loss of the Garden of Eden. And this is a passage from the moment at which Eve picks the fruit in the Garden of Eden. So saying, her rash hand in evil hour Forth reaching to the fruit, she plucked, she ate. Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing through all her works, gave signs of woe that all was lost. Perhaps then, this is just to say, is a poem which rehearses one of the most ancient themes in Judeo-Christian culture. The loss of paradise, the loss of human bliss and honesty and spontaneity. Our being in a world where we long for things that we cannot have, and a world in which we sometimes take those things, even though we're not supposed to have them, and therefore need to ask for forgiveness or make apology. Perhaps this is a poem which narrates that sense of longing, of fallen man, which describes that sense and helps us cope with living in a world of absence and loss. I suppose the thrust of this podcast has been to try to show you some of the ways in which even a not very obviously poetic poem, like This Is Just to Say, may well be engaging with some deep and profound and ancient poetic and cultural themes. The themes of human loss and desire and longing. And just as a kind of a tip to finish off with a piece of advice, I think a really important thing to bear in mind about poetry, especially when you're encountering unseen poetry, is that poems inhabit a tradition. They speak to other poems. They invoke the past. They wake it back up. And they reprocess it, recycle it through their own form. And to that extent, really good poems, to my mind, are always poems about poetry. Thanks very much.